She didn't pray for love. She prayed for help. And what God sent didn't look like anything she imagined. The wind carried dust across the land like it was trying to sweep her off it. Delilah Rose Langford stood in the doorway of her little sod house, watching the dry earth crack under the summer sun. The fields were bare. The soil, once rich and dark, looked tired now, just like her. Her hands were blistered. Her back ached. And her heart, well, she didn't know what her heart was anymore. Maybe hollow. Maybe just quiet. 3 years ago, she buried her husband under the cottonwood tree near the creek. A fever took him quick, and after that, everything moved slower. The crops failed. The animals thinned. Folks in town whispered things like, "She ought to sell," and "That land's too much for one woman." But Delilah wasn't one to leave what was hers. She had grit. Her mama used to say she was born with iron in her spine. Still, iron rusts. And it had been rusting one piece at a time. That morning her only mule had gone lame. Couldn't pull. Couldn't plow. Couldn't even walk to the well without wobbling. She sat on the porch with her head in her hands and wept. Not loud. Not wild. Just a quiet sort of crying, like the soul letting go one tear at a time. When the tears stopped, she looked up at the sky. No clouds. No answers. She went inside and pulled out the little tin box under the bed, the one that held her marriage papers, her husband's Bible, and the envelope she hadn't dared open in 2 years. The envelope held a flyer, Westward Hearts Agency, mail order companions for hardworking women of the West. She unfolded the paper. Her hands shook. She didn't want a stranger. She didn't want to share her bed or her kitchen or her prayers with someone she didn't love. But she also didn't want to lose the land her husband died trying to keep. She dipped her pen in ink and began to write. Her handwriting was neat. Her words were few. "I am looking for a husband who believes in God, works steady, and doesn't run from hard things. He must be kind. I don't care what he looks like. But I do need him to come soon." She didn't sign with a flourish. Just her name. Delilah R. Langford. Dry Creek, Wyoming Territory. That night, she lit a lantern and sat with the Bible in her lap. She didn't open it. Just held it. She didn't know what chapter to read or what prayer to say. She just whispered, "Lord, I'm tired. If you still see me, please send someone who won't break." She folded the letter the next morning and gave it to the postman who rode through once a week. He didn't say much, just tipped his hat and rode off. And then she waited. Day after day the wind blew. The chickens picked at dry ground. The mules stayed in the shade. And Delilah kept working. Cooking. Hauling water. Mending what she could. Praying when she remembered. Weeks passed. Until one quiet afternoon, a dust cloud came down the path. A wagon. And sitting at the front, holding his hat in both hands, was the biggest man she had ever seen. He was broad in the belly and round in the face, with cheeks red from the sun and eyes that looked soft and warm, like a creek that never rushed. The wagon stopped in front of her house. He stepped down, boots thudding softly in the dirt, and gave her a smile that reached all the way up to his eyes. "Ma'am," he said gently, "my name's Silas Booker. I reckon I'm your new husband if you'll still have me." Delilah stood silent. Her breath caught in her throat. He looked nothing like she imagined. And yet, something stirred in her chest. Something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. She swallowed hard. "I'm Delilah. Come in. The kettle's warm." He didn't fit the picture in her mind. But sometimes God's gifts don't come wrapped the way we imagine. Silas Booker stepped inside Delilah's little home with care, ducking his head so he wouldn't bump the low doorway. His large frame moved slowly, like he didn't want to take up too much space, even though there was no hiding how broad his shoulders were or how his belly pushed gently against his suspenders. Delilah poured hot water into 2 tin cups and slid one across the table. She didn't say much. She didn't know what to say. He sipped with both hands cupped around the cup. His fingers were thick and calloused, working hands but gentle ones. "This is good," he said softly. "Thank you kindly." Delilah nodded, then looked out the window, pretending to study the clouds. But her mind wasn't on the sky. It was on him. He was not what she expected. She had pictured someone lean, with a weather-worn face and sunburned arms. A man who rode horses and chopped wood and said little. Silas, on the other hand, looked like he belonged in a rocking chair on a porch with pie in one hand and a hymn book in the other. Still, his eyes were steady. His voice calm. There was no nervousness in him, just kindness. Silas cleared his throat. "I know I'm not what most folks picture when they send for a husband." Delilah turned to him, startled. He offered a small smile. "I've had mirrors, ma'am. I know I ain't a ranch hero from a dime novel. and I reckon more than one woman would have sent me right back on the next stage. Delilah frowned. I didn't say that. No, ma'am, he said, but I've been laughed at enough times to hear it even when it ain't said out loud. That cut deeper than she expected. She set her cup down slowly. I'm not looking for a hero, she said. I'm looking for someone who stays. Silas nodded once, slowly. Well then, I reckon you've got the right man. Later that day they walked the land together. Delilah showed him the broken gate where the chickens kept escaping. The mule's lean ribs. The cracked soil. It ain't much, she muttered, embarrassed. Silas looked around, then pointed to the hills. But it's yours. She nodded. He stepped closer to the gate and tugged gently on the broken board. This can be fixed. May take me a bit longer than a younger man, but I'll get it done. You've fixed fences before? She asked. He chuckled. Yes, ma'am. And broken bread and kneaded dough and built tables and prayed through droughts. I've done a little bit of everything. Delilah didn't smile, not quite, but her chest felt warmer. They went back inside as evening fell. She gave him a blanket and the cot near the fire. He didn't ask to sleep in her room. Didn't assume. He just said, thank you, and prayed over the supper she set on the table. Later, as she lay in her own bed, staring at the wooden ceiling, she could hear him snoring softly from the other room. Steady like a low hum of comfort. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders and whispered up to the rafters. Lord, I don't know what you're doing. But if this is your answer, help me to see it with your eyes, not mine. Outside the wind settled. And for the first time in weeks, Delilah slept without crying. Some wounds come from what folks don't say to your face, but whisper behind your back. Dry Creek was not a big town. It had one general store, one church, and one place where news traveled faster than the wind, Mabel's sewing parlor. And when Silas Booker walked into town for the first time, every needle in the room paused mid-stitch. He wasn't hard to miss. Large frame. Slow step. Shirt a little too tight across the middle. And yet, his face wore peace like a hat. He tipped it politely to every person he passed. Ma'am? Good morning, sir. Lovely weather today. His manners were cleaner than his boots. But it didn't stop the whispers. Is that him? That's the one Delilah sent for? He looks like he'd eat more than he could plow. At the feed store, Silas asked for nails, rope, and seed. He paid in full and carried every sack without a grunt. But two boys snickered behind a barrel of oats. He'll break that mule in two, one whispered. Hope her porch don't cave in when he sits, the other said. Silas heard. Of course he did. But he didn't turn around. He just smiled kindly at the shopkeeper, thanked him for the change, and walked back out into the sunlight. Delilah heard it all the next day when she came into town for flour. Mabel lowered her voice and leaned in. You sure about him, dear? He seems sweet, but you need a man who can work the land, not sink into it. Delilah's cheeks flushed. She left the flour on the counter and walked out without a word. By the time she returned home, Silas was on his knees near the chicken coop, fixing the broken fence rail. Sweat soaked through his shirt and a trickle of blood ran down his knuckle. But he was humming softly, a hymn slow and low. Something about grace. Delilah stood there for a moment just watching him. His hands moved with care. His face calm. There was no rush in him. No show. Just steady kindness. Silas, she said. He looked up, wiping his brow. Yes, ma'am? You don't have to call me ma'am. He smiled a little. It's habit. I was raised on please, and thank you, and ma'am, even when I got laughed at for it. She came closer, setting the flour sack down on the porch. Do they laugh at you often? She asked, knowing the answer. Silas leaned back and rested on his knees. Sometimes. Mostly when folks don't know what else to do with something that don't fit their picture. Delilah looked at his strong hands. The bandaged finger. The new fence rail in place. They don't see what I see, she said softly. Silas tilted his head. And what do you see, Miss Delilah? She swallowed. Someone who stays. That night, they sat by the fire with cornbread and beans between them. Silas shared a story about his younger brother, who always teased him but cried like a baby when he left for the West. Delilah laughed, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in months. Later she brought out the old Bible. Her husband's name was still written on the first page. She hadn't opened it since the funeral. She handed it to Silas. Would you read something? She asked. He opened it gently, like it was a bird in his hands. His voice was soft and deep as he read from the book of Psalms. The Lord is near to the broken-hearted, and saves the crushed in spirit. Delilah closed her eyes and listened. The words weren't just read, they were lived. And in that moment, for the first time since the day the letter went out, she began to believe. Maybe God had seen her after all. She thought strength came with broad shoulders and quick hands. But strength can also come slow and steady as faith. The sun rose red the next morning, slipping through the cracks of the barn like warm honey. Delilah was already up, bucket in hand, heading to the coop. She didn't wake Silas. He had worked late into the night, reinforcing the fence and fixing the barn door that had been swinging on one hinge for weeks. He didn't move fast, but he didn't stop either. That, she was learning, was the kind of strength that mattered. As she reached the pen, a sharp bleating sound stopped her cold. One of the lambs, a late spring baby, was lying on its side, legs stiff, its little belly heaving. Its mother circled, crying low and wild. Delilah dropped the bucket. Her late husband had always been the one to tend sick animals. She knew nothing about lamb fever, nothing about what to do. She knelt beside the animal, her hands shaking. "Lord, help me," she whispered. Footsteps pounded behind her. Heavy ones. Silas. He came half-dressed, suspenders still loose, hair a mess, boots untied, but his eyes were wide and sure. He dropped to his knees beside her. "What happened?" he asked gently. "I don't know," she said. "He was just like this when I came out." Silas touched the lamb's side, then felt its ears, its gums. He worked quiet, like someone who didn't want to scare a scared thing. "My mama was a healer," he said. "Didn't matter if it had 2 legs or 4, she taught me to watch and listen first." Delilah blinked. "You know what's wrong with it?" He nodded. "Likely caught cold in the night. Belly's bloated. Might be a fever coming on." He didn't panic. He didn't guess. He moved like a man who'd saved small things before. Within minutes, Silas had the lamb swaddled in a flour sack and placed near the fire inside the cabin. He mixed molasses with a pinch of salt and fed it from a cloth-wrapped spoon. Delilah just watched. Not because she couldn't help, but because she was seeing something she didn't expect. Silas wasn't just big in body. He was big in patience, big in care, big in mercy. He whispered to the lamb as he worked, calling it little one, and telling it stories about a warm barn he once built back in Tennessee. By noon, the lamb stirred weakly and let out a soft sound. Its legs moved. Its belly eased. "It's going to make it," he said. Delilah felt tears press behind her eyes. She turned away quickly, pretending to stir the fire. She didn't want him to see her cry again. But he did. "You okay?" he asked, standing slowly. She nodded, wiping her face with her sleeve. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Booker." He smiled. "I'm full of a lot of things, Miss Delilah. Mostly beans and biscuits. But some good things too, I hope." She laughed. A real one. Short and light but real. They stood by the fire in the quiet, just watching that lamb breathe. "I always thought strength meant someone who could lift more than me," she whispered. Silas didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Sometimes it means someone who can kneel beside you and not try to fix you, but sit with you until you heal." Delilah looked at him then, really looked. His shirt had a stain on the pocket. His boots were too worn. He wasn't fast. He wasn't fine. But he was steady. He was safe. And maybe, just maybe, he was exactly what she needed. Sometimes, the one who needs rescuing is the one who's always been strong. The wind shifted that morning. It didn't howl. It didn't roar. It just carried something different, a kind of quiet hush that made the trees lean in close like they were waiting for something. Delilah had woken with a sharp pain in her ankle. She'd stepped wrong on a rock the evening before while fetching water, but hadn't thought much of it. This morning it was worse. She limped through the cabin, clenching her jaw, hoping Silas wouldn't notice. But of course he did. "You all right there?" he asked from the porch where he was oiling the hinges of the front gate. "I'm fine," she said, brushing past him. "Just a little twist." He stood slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers. "That don't look little, Miss Delilah. Sit down, please." "I've got work to do," she said. "Chores don't care if I'm limping." Silas walked over to her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "And I do." That stopped her. She let him guide her to the wooden bench by the stove. He knelt, tugged off her boot with great care, and looked at the swelling ankle. He said. "That needs wrapping. And rest. No walking today." "I don't have time for rest." "You don't have a choice, ma'am." His voice was still soft, but firm enough that she didn't argue. Silas did everything that day. He hauled water from the well, cooked the oats, fed the chickens, and even mucked out the little goat shed, all without a complaint. When she tried to rise, he shook his head and helped her sit right back down. That afternoon she heard banging and clanging from the kitchen. "What are you doing in there?" she called. Something new, he answered. By sundown the cabin was filled with the smell of cornbread, rabbit stew and something sweet, cinnamon maybe. When Silas brought it to her on a tray, Delilah stared. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" He chuckled. "My mama ran a boarding house. She always said, if a man wants to eat well, he'd better learn to make something better than burnt beans." Delilah took a bite of the stew. Her eyes widened. She didn't say a word, just kept eating, spoon after spoon, like her body had been waiting for real food, real comfort. Silas sat nearby with his own bowl, chewing quietly. "I haven't tasted anything like this in a long time," she said between bites. "Well, I haven't had anyone to cook for in a long time," he answered. She looked at him then, not just across the room but really looked. His face was flushed from the stove's heat. His hands were rough but clean. And his eyes, they didn't ask for anything. They just gave. "You know," she said slowly, "I never expected to feel safe again." He turned to her. "And do you?" She nodded. "Yes," she said. "I think I do." That night, Silas cleaned the dishes, banked the fire, and wrapped her ankle again before heading to the cot near the fireplace. Delilah, resting in bed, watched the flickering shadows dance across the log walls. She had asked God for help, for someone strong. But she was learning something new. Strength didn't always roar like thunder or ride in like a storm. Sometimes strength came with wide hands that cooked and cleaned. With a soft voice that calmed you when you didn't know you needed calming. With a heart that didn't flinch when the world laughed. She stared at the ceiling and whispered, "Thank you, Lord." Then she closed her eyes and slept deeper than she had in years. He never fought back when they laughed. But this time, someone needed saving. The valley was quiet after a soft rain, the kind that didn't flood but left puddles for ducks and life for the thirsty ground. The dust had settled. The field smelled of wet earth and hope. Delilah was finally walking again, slowly, with a cane Silas carved from a branch. "You didn't have to do that," she told him as she tested the handle. Silas just smiled. "You needed it. That's enough." They were sitting on the porch when the sound of hurried hooves broke the calm. A young boy rode hard down the road, yelling breathlessly as he passed. Miss Annie's wagon crashed near Devil's Drop. "She's stuck, can't move." Delilah stood too fast and wobbled. "That's the widow with the 2 little boys." Silas was already fetching the rope and hitching the mule to the cart. "Stay here," he said gently. "No," she said, grabbing her shawl. "We're both going." Devil's Drop was a steep ravine on the edge of town, where the road narrowed and turned sharp. The earth was still wet from rain, and Annie Talbert's wagon had slid sideways. One wheel hung off the edge. Her 2 sons were crying inside, too scared to jump. A few men had gathered but stood frozen, not sure what to do. They saw Silas pull up and exchange glances. "He won't be any help," someone muttered. "He's too heavy to climb down there." Silas didn't answer. He took one look, tied a rope to a tree and looped it around his waist. Then he handed the other end to Delilah. "Hold it tight," he said. "Even if they don't believe I can do it, I believe the Lord gave me strength for this." Delilah didn't argue. He climbed down, slow and sure, his boots digging into soft dirt, his arms anchoring each step. Annie's eyes widened. "I can't reach them," she cried. "They're trapped." Silas nodded calmly. "Let me help." He climbed carefully to the wagon, then crawled inside. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He just whispered gentle words to the boys until their crying stopped. Then one by one he carried them out, cradled them like they were made of spun glass. His footing never slipped. His arms never wavered. Once both boys were safe, he helped Annie down. She was shaking. "You saved us," she whispered. Silas nodded, then smiled. "You're all right now." By the time they returned to town, the sun was dipping low. People stood outside their homes. They'd heard. No one laughed. No one sneered. For the first time, the town saw Silas not as a joke, but as a man who did what others couldn't. A man who acted when others watched. A man who saved without asking for thanks. That night, Delilah cooked supper. She didn't let Silas lift a finger. She set the table with her best cloth, the one she hadn't used in years. She baked biscuits and opened the last jar of peach preserves. As they sat down, Silas looked at her, puzzled. "What's all this?" "You're the man this house was waiting for," she said quietly. His eyes softened. "And you're the woman I prayed for." She bowed her head. They prayed together, hand in hand this time. And in the quiet that followed, Delilah realized something. The laughter of others didn't matter anymore. Because Silas had done something no one else could. He'd held the broken, carried the afraid, and stood firm on shaking ground. and in doing so he'd become the strongest man she'd ever known. She thought she was the only one with a wound that wouldn't heal. Then she heard the name he never meant to say. The air was crisp the next morning, cool enough to wear a shawl, warm enough to hang laundry without it freezing stiff. Delilah pegged the last sheet to the line while Silas worked at the woodpile. His axe was steady but not fast, every motion slow like prayer in motion. She liked to watch him work. Not because it was impressive but because it was good. Simple. Honest. But that morning his rhythm paused. He stood still, eyes far off as if hearing something that wasn't there. Delilah walked over and offered a cup of water. "You all right?" He took it, nodding slowly. "Yes, ma'am. Just thinking." "What about?" Silas looked down at his hands, turning the cup slowly between them. For a long time he said nothing. Then softly he spoke. "Her name was Margaret." Delilah blinked. "Who?" He gave a small, tired smile. "My fiancée. Before I came here." Delilah's hands stilled. The birds kept singing, the sheets fluttered, but everything inside her felt still and heavy. "I didn't know you were engaged," she said, trying to sound calm. "I don't speak of her much," he said, his voice low. "But I reckon it's time." They sat on the porch together, the cup between them on the table. Silas looked out toward the hills. She was a seamstress back east. Sweet smile. Strong hands. Told me once she didn't mind my size. Said I reminded her of a good oak tree, slow growing but steady. "So what happened?" Delilah asked. Silas breathed deep. "We were set to marry that spring. Her mother was ill, so we postponed. I waited. Wrote letters. Sent money. And then one day, I got a reply. Not from her. From her sister." Delilah sat still. She said Margaret had married another man. A preacher's son. Thinner, sharper, more polished. Said she wanted a life that fit in with what people expected. Delilah's chest ached for him. "What did you do?" "I prayed. I packed. I left. I figured maybe somewhere out west, there'd be land wide enough to forget her." He chuckled once, a sound that didn't hold joy. "But forgetting don't come easy." Delilah placed her hand gently over his. "Neither does forgiving." He looked at her, startled. She didn't pull her hand away. "I still carry things too," she whispered. "My husband died before I could say goodbye. Sometimes I wonder if I loved him enough. Sometimes I wonder if he loved me the way I thought he did." They sat in silence. Not the empty kind, but the kind where two wounds meet and neither tries to cover up. "I'm not her," Delilah said. "I know," Silas whispered. "And you're not him. I hope that's a good thing." "It is," she said. She looked out toward the horizon, where the golden fields swayed and a hawk circled in slow loops above. "You're the first person I've prayed with since I lost him," she said. "And the first man who ever sat still long enough to listen." Silas turned his hand over beneath hers, until they were palm to palm. "Then maybe," he said softly, "God's been healing us both, and we just didn't see it happening." Delilah didn't speak. She just squeezed his hand once, slow and sure. And in that quiet space between past hurts and new beginnings, something unspoken took root, something deeper than comfort and warmer than friendship. It was trust. And it was growing. Sometimes we pray for rain and only get clouds. But when it finally comes, it soaks more than just the land, it softens the heart. It started with a smell. The air shifted around noon, cooler, damp, and full of promise. Delilah stood on the porch, the wash basin still in her hands, when the first breeze brushed past her cheek. She stopped. She knew that smell. Rain. "Silas," she called. He came out from the barn, his shirt half-buttoned, sawdust in his hair. "What is it?" She didn't answer, just tipped her head to the wind. He sniffed, then grinned. "Well, I'll be. Smells like heaven's getting ready to open up." They both stood there like children waiting for a gift. The skies darkened. The clouds rolled in like slow-moving herds across the wide Wyoming sky. The wind picked up just a little, enough to stir the trees, enough to make the chickens run for cover. Then like a sigh the first drop fell. 1, 2, then 1,000. The dry earth drank it in with greedy thirst. Delilah laughed, full reel from the belly. She held out her arms and lifted her face. Rain soaked her hair. She didn't care. Silas stood beside her, arms crossed, grinning from ear to ear. "You're gonna catch cold. Then I'll be a happy sick woman." The rain kept falling. They ran for the barn, the two of them soaked through and laughing. Delilah slipped in the mud, but Silas caught her before she fell. His big arms wrapped around her waist and they both stood there, frozen in the moment. Not out of fear, but wonder. She looked up at him, blinking rain from her eyes. And for the first time she let herself rest in his arms without feeling shame, or guilt, or the ache of memory. She felt safe. She felt held. Inside the barn they lit a lantern. The soft orange glow painted their faces warm. Silas shook off his hat. God sure does wait until the last minute sometimes. Delilah wrung out her skirt. He's always on time. We just don't always see the clock he's using. Silas nodded slowly. You sound like a preacher. My papa was one, she said. A soft-spoken kind. He used to say, don't just thank God when he sends the rain. Thank him when the skies are dry, 'cause that's when roots dig deep. Silas smiled. They stood in the barn doorway watching the water gather in little puddles. Watching the dry land soften. After a while Delilah said, I never thought I'd laugh like this again. He looked at her. You should. Every day. Silas didn't move closer. He didn't try to take her hand or say something clever. He just stood beside her. That was enough. Sometimes love didn't arrive with fireworks or grand speeches. Sometimes it came quiet, on the sound of rain and laughter, and soft glances between two people who were learning how to hope again. Later that night the fire crackled steady. Delilah dried her hair by the hearth while Silas wrote in a little notebook he kept tucked in his coat. She had never asked what he wrote until now. What's in there? She asked. He looked up. My prayers. Mind if I read one? He hesitated, then nodded. She opened to the most recent page. The ink was fresh. Read. Lord, I know I'm not what the world wanted for her. But I pray I can be what she needs. Help me love steady like you do. Help me be home to someone who's lost it too many times. Delilah closed the notebook and set it gently on the table. You already are, she whispered. And she meant it. She found it by accident. But it answered a question her heart had been too afraid to ask. The rain had soaked the valley for 2 full days. The parched land drank deeply, and the creek behind the barn finally began to sing again. Everything felt cleaner, softer, even the air. Delilah had opened the back room to sort through the old chest left by her late husband, the one she had kept locked since the funeral. It wasn't for any reason she could explain. Just something about it felt too final, too heavy. But now, with the cabin full of warmth and Silas humming softly in the kitchen, the chest no longer scared her. She knelt and opened the lid. Inside were simple things. A Bible, her late husband's pocket knife, a torn work shirt, and under it all, a stack of letters tied in twine. Most were letters from neighbors and old bills. But one was still sealed. Her name was on the front. Delilah Booker. Booker. She sat back slowly. Booker was Silas's last name. She opened the letter with trembling fingers. Dear Delilah. If you're reading this, it means I didn't come back. I'm sorry. I did something I shouldn't have. I borrowed money I couldn't repay. Not from a bank, from a man named Booker. I thought I could flip it, double it, buy that extra parcel of land we dreamed of. But I failed you. And the debt fell on him. I don't know if you'll ever meet him. I only know this, he wasn't like the others. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He said, I'll forgive the debt if you promise me something. I asked what? He said, be honest with her. Tell her the truth. I never did. I couldn't face you. So if you ever meet a man named Silas Booker, trust him. He's better than I ever was. Look. The letter fell from her fingers. She sat on the floor, breath caught in her throat. The silence in the room was so deep she could hear the tick of the old clock on the mantel. Silas had known. He had known who she was. He had known what her husband did. He had known before he ever answered her letter. And he came anyway. He hadn't come to punish her. He hadn't come to collect what was owed. He had come to build a coop, fix a porch, kneel beside a lamb, whisper prayers into the quiet. He had come to love. Delilah walked into the kitchen. Silas stood at the stove, stirring something with a wooden spoon, humming low. When he turned and saw her holding the letter, he stopped. I found it, she said softly. He looked at her but didn't speak. You knew, she whispered. You knew all along. He set the spoon down and wiped his hands. Yes. Why didn't you say something? He looked down at the floor, then back at her. Because I didn't come to take anything. I came to give something. She blinked, tears already stinging. I came because God told me to stop running, he said. To forgive your husband. To offer help instead of hurt. To love someone even if they didn't ask for it. Delilah's hands trembled. All this time. I thought I needed someone strong enough to hold the ranch together. She took a step closer. But I think God knew I needed someone strong enough to hold me together. Silas took her hand. He didn't say anything fancy. Just squeezed it gently. They stood like that in the middle of the kitchen. No music, no grand moment, just the sound of rain on the roof and a peace that hadn't been there before. It wasn't the vows or the name she'd take that changed her life, it was the quiet way he kept showing up, even when no one else did. Spring had fully settled into the valley. The fields were green again and the orchard behind the barn, once nothing but brittle sticks, now held blossoms so pink and white they looked like God had painted them with a gentle brush. Delilah stood at the back porch, barefoot, holding a cup of warm tea between her palms. Her ankle had healed. Her heart too. At least, the worst of it. Inside, Silas was humming again. He always hummed when he was at peace. And today he had good reason. Today was their wedding day. They hadn't planned a big affair. There were no lace-covered tables, no silver forks, no carriages or banners in the street. But there was a clean white tablecloth, a ribbon in Delilah's hair, and a wooden cross Silas carved himself, placed at the edge of the river. He had wanted to marry her there. Not in the church where folks might whisper. Not under a roof where gossip still lingered. But beside the river. Where the water ran clean. Where grace flowed quietly. Where hearts could start over. The townsfolk came anyway. First came Annie Talbert and her 2 boys, wearing their cleanest boots and carrying wildflowers from the hill. Then came old Mr. Talbot from the feed store, the same man who once laughed when Silas couldn't fit in the chair on his porch. This time, he brought a loaf of cornbread and a Bible under his arm. Even Mabel came, the sewing woman, her eyes red but her hands kind. She patted Delilah's shoulder and whispered, "You were right about him." And of course the preacher came. He wore boots instead of shoes and stood with both hands on his worn Bible like it had been his compass through more than one storm. When Delilah walked down the grassy path there was no music. No lace. Just wind in the trees and the soft rush of the river behind them. Silas stood tall, his vest too snug, his collar a little crooked but his eyes, steady. Full of truth. He didn't look like a man who was laughed at anymore. He looked like a man who had waited his whole life for this one holy moment. The preacher spoke slow. Marriage is a covenant, a promise made before man and more importantly before God. He turned to Silas. Do you, Silas Booker, take Delilah to be your wife, to comfort, to honor, to protect, and to pray beside all the days the Lord gives you? Silas looked at her, then nodded. With all my strength. And all my softness. The preacher smiled, then turned. And Delilah, do you take Silas to be your husband, to stand beside, to care for, and to trust, even when the days are dry and hard? Delilah didn't hesitate. With all my heart, she said, and all the pieces it broke into, because he helped me gather every one. The preacher said the words. You may kiss the bride. And when Silas leaned forward, slow and trembling, and brushed his lips to hers, soft, reverent, holy, nobody laughed. Because no one dared to interrupt a moment God had clearly touched. That night, they sat on the porch in their plain clothes, side by side, watching the moon rise over the hills. Silas reached into his pocket and handed her something. It was a box, small and carved from cherry wood. She opened it. Inside was a ring, not gold but polished silver with a tiny engraving inside. She read the words aloud. You are not what the world expected. You are what I prayed for. Her hands shook. How long have you had this? She asked. Made it when I first came, he said. Wasn't sure if I'd ever get to give it. She slipped it on her finger, slow and careful. Then she leaned her head on his shoulder. You're still too quiet sometimes, she whispered. And you still talk in your sleep, he smiled. She laughed. And for a long while there was no need for words. Just the sound of the river flowing behind them, like grace moving forward, slow and sure. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, please share it with someone who might need hope. Sometimes the world overlooks the gentle ones, the quiet ones, the ones who don't fit the mold. But God doesn't. He sees the broken and sends comfort. He sees the prayer whispered in the dark, and sends someone kind enough to answer it. Subscribe for more stories of healing, faith, and simple, lasting love. Comment below. Which moment in Silas and Delilah's journey meant the most to you? Let their story remind you, you are never too far gone for grace to find you.